What happens when you have nothing left to lose? Not even your own name. We're about to tell you the story of a ghost of a woman, adrift in the brutal wilderness of the American West, with no past to claim and no future to hope for. She was a blank page, waiting for a story to be written upon her. But she never imagined that story would begin with her being taken, not asked, but taken by the most feared man in the territory, the cold and powerful rancher, Elias Thorne. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of a brutal secret, a forgotten identity, and a love forged in the fires of fear and desperation. Stay with us. The sun was a merciless god in the Montana Territory. It beat down on the woman's cracked lips and the threadbare shawl covering her head, offering no reprieve, only a relentless baking heat that shimmered off the dusty track, pretending to be a street. She didn't know her name. It was a hole in her mind, a black, empty space where a life used to be. The memories she did have were fragmented, violent shards, the splintering of wood, the scream of a horse, a man's face contorted in rage, and then a long, jarring darkness. She had woken up by a shallow creek bed 2 weeks prior, with a throbbing ache in her skull and clothes that were torn and stained with something dark. The only clue to her identity was a small silver locket cold against her skin, which refused to open. She had stumbled into the town of Redemption, a name so steeped in irony, it was almost cruel. Redemption was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or a place they ended up when they had nowhere else to fall. It was a collection of rickety buildings, a saloon that stank of stale beer and desperation, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple leaned as if in perpetual prayer for the town's lost souls. For days, she had survived on the scraps of kindness from the preacher's wife, Martha, who had given her the shawl and a place to sleep in the hayloft behind the church. But Martha's husband, Reverend Michael, was a man of dwindling faith and even more dwindling charity. His patience had worn thin. The girl attracts whispers, she'd overheard him say last night, his voice a low grumble through the floorboards. A woman with no name and no man is a magnet for trouble. She cannot stay. So now she stood outside the general store, a ghost in the midday sun, trying to summon the courage to beg for work she knew she wouldn't get. The store owner, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, had already shooed her away twice. Men tipped their hats not in respect, but with a leering curiosity. Women pulled their children closer, their eyes full of suspicion. She was a stain on their precarious social fabric. The rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves pulled her from her stupor. It was a sound different from the usual plodding of farm nags or the nervous energy of cowboys' mounts. This was a heavy, confident, and deliberate sound. A massive black stallion, all muscle and midnight sheen, came to a halt directly in front of her. Atop it sat a man who seemed to have been carved from the very rock of the surrounding mountains. He wasn't just tall in the saddle. He was immense. A wide-brimmed black hat shadowed a face that was all harsh angles and unforgiving lines. A thick, dark beard did little to soften a jaw that looked like it could crack stone. But it was his eyes that seized the air from her lungs. They were a pale, chilling grey, like a winter sky. And they were fixed on her with an intensity that felt less like he was looking at her, and more like he was looking through her. The whispers around her died instantly. The lazy chatter from the saloon porch evaporated. Even the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. A blanket of fear, thick and palpable, settled over the street. This was Elias Thorne. His name was a legend, a curse, a prayer of thanks that he wasn't looking your way. His ranch, the Thorn Crest, was the largest in the territory, spanning more land than most men could walk in a week. He had built his empire with ruthless efficiency, swallowing smaller ranches controlling water rights and dealing with rivals in ways that were spoken of only in hushed, frightened tones. He was a man who took what he wanted. He never came to town. Not unless he wanted something. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, his grey eyes cataloguing her torn dress, her bare, dusty feet, the tremor in her hands. She felt pinned by his gaze, a moth to a board. She wanted to run, to shrink into nothing, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Slowly, deliberately, he dismounted. The stallion stood as still as a statue. Elias Thorne walked towards her, his spurs ringing a lonely metallic dirge on the wooden boardwalk. He stopped a foot in front of her. He was even taller on the ground, a mountain of a man who blocked out the sun. He smelled of leather horses and the cold, clean air of the high country. He reached out a hand. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a command. She flinched, a lifetime of forgotten instincts, screaming at her. But she didn't move away. His fingers, calloused and surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray lock of tangled blonde hair from her cheek. It was a gesture so incongruous with the fear he inspired that it sent a jolt of confusion through her. His gaze flickered to the silver locket at her throat. For a fraction of a second, his expression changed. It wasn't softening, but a flicker of something else recognition. No, that was impossible. It was something deeper, darker. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cold, unreadable mask. "You," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. Before she could process the word, before she could find her own voice to ask what he meant, he moved with a speed that defied his size. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. A small, involuntary cry of shock escaped her lips. The other hand went to the back of her head, pressing her face into the rough fabric of his coat, muffling any further sound, and hiding her from the prying eyes of the town. He turned and strode back to his stallion, carrying her as easily as a sack of flour. He swung himself into the saddle, settling her in front of him. Her side pressed against the hard wall of his chest. His arm remained locked around her, an iron bar from which there was no escape. The entire town of Redemption watched in stunned silence. Mr. Abernathy stood frozen on his porch. The cowboys in the saloon doorway were motionless. Even Reverend Michael, who had just stepped out of the church, stared with his mouth agape. No one moved. No one spoke. To challenge Elias Thorne was to invite ruin. He spurred the black stallion not with a kick, but with a subtle pressure. The great horse turned and began to walk, then trot, then gallop out of town, leaving the dust and the fear and the silence behind. The woman held fast against the most feared man in the territory, squeezed her eyes shut. She had no man. She had no name. She had nowhere to go. And now she had been taken. She didn't know if this was a rescue or a capture. As the wind whipped tears from her eyes, and the town of Redemption vanished behind her, suspected it might be both. The ride to Thorn Crest was a blur of raw power and terror. Elias Thorne said nothing, his body a rigid fortress around her, his focus entirely on the trail ahead. The landscape changed, climbing from the flat, dusty plains into rolling foothills covered in sagebrush and pine. The air grew cooler, cleaner. They rode for hours, leaving civilization far behind, until the only sounds were the horses' breathing, the creak of leather, and the pounding of her own heart. Finally, they crested a high ridge, and she saw it. Thorn Crest was not just a ranch. It was a kingdom. Nestled in a wide, verdant valley, a massive 2-story log house stood like a sentinel flanked by a barn larger than the church in Redemption and a series of corrals teeming with horses. A river, the lifeblood of the valley, snaked its way through lush pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed. The entire valley was ringed by jagged, snow-capped peaks that seemed to cut it off from the rest of the world. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so, but it was also isolated. A fortress. A prison. As they approached the main house, a man came out onto the porch. He was leaner than Thorn, with a weathered face and watchful eyes. He moved with the quiet competence of a man who knew his business. He wiped his hands on his trousers and waited. Thorn brought the stallion to a halt and dismounted in one fluid motion. He then reached up for her. She hesitated, her muscles stiff with fear. His grey eyes met hers, and for the first time he spoke to her directly, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "You can get down yourself, or I can take you down. It makes no mind to me." Finding a sliver of defiance, she slid down from the saddle, her legs shaky as they touched the ground. She stumbled, and his hand shot out his fingers, wrapping around her upper arm to steady her. His grip was firm, a reminder of his strength and her powerlessness. "Caleb," Thorn said to the waiting man, "see to my horse, and send for Mrs. Gable." Caleb's gaze flickered to her a brief questioning look before he nodded. "Right away, Elias." He took the stallion's reins, his expression carefully neutral, but she could feel his curiosity like a physical touch. Thorn released her arm and gestured toward the house with a slight inclination of his head. "Inside." The interior of the house was as surprising as the valley. It was a stark contrast to its rugged log exterior. The main room was wrapped with a towering stone fireplace, polished wood floors covered in rich Navajo rugs and furniture that was heavy, dark, and clearly expensive. Bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes lined one wall. It was a room of wealth, power, and masculine taste, but it was also clean and meticulously cared for. A stern-looking woman in a severe black dress with a crisp white apron appeared from a hallway. She had her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her face seemed permanently set in a look of disapproval. This had to be Mrs. Gable. "You sent for me, Mr. Thorn?" she asked, her voice as starched as her apron. Her eyes landed on the woman, and her lips thinned into a razor line. "This is—" Elias paused, his gaze falling upon her, as if he were only just now considering the problem of her lack of a name. "She will be staying here. Prepare the east guest room. See that she has a bath and find her some suitable clothes. Something of Martha's." The mention of the name Martha caused a strange, sharp stillness in the room. Mrs. Gable's expression, already severe, tightened with a flicker of what looked like pain. She shot a look at Elias, a silent communication passing between them that the woman couldn't decipher. "Sir, I don't think—" Mrs. Gable began. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." "Beatrice," Elias cut her off, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. "I was giving you an order. Use Martha's things." Mrs. Gable paled slightly and gave a curt, angry nod. "As you wish, sir." She turned her cold eyes on the woman. "Follow me." The woman cast one last frightened look at Elias Thorne, who had already turned his back on her and was pouring himself a whiskey at a sideboard. He seemed to have dismissed her completely. With no other choice, she followed the housekeeper up a wide staircase. The east guest room was beautiful, with a large four-poster bed, a window overlooking the stunning valley, and a small private fireplace. But the windows were fitted with heavy latches, and the door had a thick, solid bolt on the outside. Mrs. Gable pointed to a connecting door. "The bath is through there. I will have water brought up. I will lay out some clothes. You are not to leave this room until Mr. Thorne says so. Is that understood?" The woman could only nod her throat, too tight to speak. Left alone, she sank onto the edge of the plush bed, the springs sighing under her negligible weight. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. A stranger stared back at her thin pale with haunted eyes and hair like a tangled bird's nest. Who was she? Why was she here? Why did the most powerful man in the territory pluck her from obscurity? And who was Martha? The bath was a luxury she hadn't known in weeks. As she scrubbed away the layers of dirt and grime, she felt like she was shedding a skin. But the questions remained circling in her mind. The clothes Mrs. Gable had laid out were simple but of fine quality. A soft chemise and a deep blue cotton dress that fit her surprisingly well. They felt impossibly clean and soft against her skin. In a drawer she found brushes and combs. As she worked the tangles from her hair, it fell in a cascade of pale blonde waves to her shoulders. Looking in the mirror again, she saw not a waif, but a woman. A woman with no past, but a present that was deeply, terrifyingly uncertain. Later, a soft knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, with a tray of food, roast chicken bread, a slice of apple pie. It was more food than she had seen in a month. She ate ravenously, the simple act of satisfying her hunger, a small victory in this overwhelming place. For the next few days, a strange routine settled in. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She spent her time in the room reading books from the shelf, or simply staring out the window at the vast, untouchable beauty of the valley. Mrs. Gable brought her meals 3 times a day. Her expression always a mixture of resentment and pity. She never spoke more than was necessary. The woman saw Elias Thorne only occasionally, and always from a distance. She would see him crossing the yard, directing his men with sharp, concise gestures, or riding his black stallion out towards the high pastures at dawn. He never looked up at her window. It was as if he had brought her here and then forgotten about her. The isolation was a torment. The not knowing was worse. One evening, driven by a desperate need for answers, she tried the door. To her surprise, the bolt wasn't latched. Hesitantly, she opened it and crept down the silent hallway. She found him in the great room, sitting in a large leather armchair by the fire, the whiskey decanter on the table beside him. The room was dark, save for the flickering firelight, which cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply watched her approach, his grey eyes glinting in the firelight. "You should be in your room," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "Why am I here?" She whispered the words she had been screaming in her mind for days, finally finding voice. "What do you want with me?" He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "I saw you in town. You were alone. In trouble." "There are other people in trouble," she countered, her voice gaining a little strength. "Why me?" He was silent for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You reminded me of someone." "Martha." She asked the name, tasting strange on her lips. His jaw tightened. The muscle ticked. "That is none of your concern." He stood up, towering over her. "Go back to your room. Do not leave it again, unless I say you can." His tone was final, a steel door slamming shut. But as she turned to leave, her hand instinctively went to the locket at her throat. "This," she said, turning back to him. "Do you know what it is? I can't open it." He strode towards her and stopped, his gaze fixed on the small silver oval. He reached out, and his fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against her neck as he took the locket. He held it in his large palm, his thumb tracing its intricate floral engravings. He didn't try to open it. "Some things are best left closed," he said, his voice low and guttural. He dropped it, letting it fall back against her chest. "Now go." Defeated, she retreated to her room, the bolt clicking shut behind her with a dreadful finality. She lay in the dark, her mind racing. He hadn't taken her for work. He hadn't taken her for pleasure. He had taken her because she was a reflection of a ghost named Martha. She was a stand-in for the dead. And as she drifted into a troubled sleep, she realized the truth. Her gilded key was not a home, it was a mausoleum, and she was the living ghost meant to haunt it. Weeks bled into a month. The woman who had started answering to the name Eliza after finding it in one of the books in her room grew stronger. The regular meals filled out her frame, and the Montana sun observed from her window brought a touch of color to her cheeks. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a dull, aching curiosity and a profound loneliness. Elias Thorne remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He allowed her out of the room, first into the main house, then into the small walled garden behind it, where Mrs. Gable grew herbs and late-season roses. These freedoms were granted without explanation, small parcels of trust she didn't understand. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. When she was reading by the fire, she would look up and find him watching her from the shadows. When she walked in the garden, she would catch a glimpse of him on the porch, motionless. She learned more about him from observation than from conversation. She saw his interactions with his men. He was a hard master, demanding perfection, but he was also fair. She saw Caleb the foreman argue with him over the price of cattle, a tense but respectful exchange between two men who understood each other. She saw his surprising gentleness, with the horses his large hands calming a spooked filly with a touch. There were layers to Elias Thorne, and this complexity was far more frightening than simple cruelty would have been. Her relationship with Mrs. Gable also began to thaw, albeit slowly. The housekeeper's resentment was a shield protecting a deep old wound. One afternoon, as Eliza helped her weed the garden, she dared to ask, "Mrs. Gable, who was Martha?" The housekeeper stiffened her hands, freezing in the soil. She stayed silent for so long that Eliza thought she wouldn't answer. "Martha was Mr. Thorne's wife," she finally said, her voice brittle. "She was my sister." The revelation struck Eliza like a physical blow. "His wife, what? What happened to her?" "She died," Mrs. Gable said flatly, resuming her weeding with a furious energy. 5 years ago. Here, in this valley." Her gaze drifted towards the river. "She drowned. A terrible accident." The pieces began to click into place. The grief that hung in the house like a shroud, Thorne's self-imposed isolation, his obsessive watchfulness, and his interest in her. Eliza looked down at her own hands, at her fair skin and blonde hair. She must bear a resemblance to the lost wife, a ghost he was trying to resurrect. The thought sent a chill down her spine. He loved her very much, Eliza said softly. Mrs. Gable snorted a harsh, bitter sound. He worshipped her, and he suffocated her. He built this fortress to keep her safe from the world, and in the end it couldn't even keep her safe from a slip on a wet rock. He has never forgiven himself. She finally looked at Eliza, her eyes filled with a stark warning. He sees her when he looks at you. Don't you ever forget that. You are a comfort to him, girl, but you are also a curse. The fragile piece of thorn crest was shattered by the arrival of another rider. This was no ranch hand. This man rode with a swagger, his clothes too fine for the frontier, his smile too hot and predatory. He was flanked by 2 hired guns who looked as mean as rattlesnakes. He rode right up to the house as if he owned it and bellowed from the porch. "Thorn, get out here. I know you're in there, you brooding bastard." Elias emerged from the barn, wiping his hands with a rag. He moved with no sense of urgency, but his body was coiled like a spring. "What do you want, Jedediah? Jedediah Kane?" Mrs. Gable whispered from the kitchen window, where she and Eliza were watching. "He owns the Rocking Quay, east of the Divide. A snake in the grass, that one. He and Mr. Thorne have been at each other's throats for years over grazing rights." Jedediah Kane grinned a flash of white teeth in a sun-browned face. "Just a neighborly visit. Heard you had some new livestock. I came to see for myself." His eyes scanned the house, lingering on the upstairs windows. "My livestock is my business," Thorne said, his voice flat and cold. "Is it?" Kane leaned against a porch post, feigning casualness. "Word travels, Elias, even all the way out here. They say you rode into Redemption and carried off a nameless woman. Got the whole town spooked. That's not like you. You've been holed up on this mountain mourning your dead wife for 5 years. Now all of a sudden you take in a stray. People are asking questions." "Let them ask," Thorne growled. Kane pushed himself off the post. "I'm more of a man of action myself. I hear things. I hear about a woman lost her memory, showed up out of nowhere. Fits a certain description." He took a step closer to Thorne. "I also hear that some very important, very wealthy people back in San Francisco are looking for their missing daughter. A girl named Elizabeth St. Clair. Lost after a stagecoach was attacked up near the pass a couple of months back. They've hired Pinkertons and everything. The reward is substantial." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Elizabeth St. Clair. The name meant nothing to her. And yet, it sent a strange echo through the empty halls of her mind. She clutched the locket at her neck. Thorne's expression didn't change, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "You've been listening to saloon gossip, Kane. You should know better than to bring your filth onto my land." "Is it gossip?" Kane's eyes glinted with malice. "Or is it the truth you're hiding behind those walls?" "What's she to you, Thorne? A replacement for the one you couldn't save. If she is who I think she is, you're playing a dangerous game. Her family won't take kindly to some backwoods rancher holding her captive." "She is under my protection," Thorne said, each word a chip of ice. "That's all you need to know." "Protection?" Kane laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Looks more like a cage to me. I'll be back, Thorne, and I'll find out the truth. A prize like that. She's worth more than just land or water rights." With a final insolent wink towards the house, Jedediah Kane mounted his horse and rode away, his hired guns trailing behind him like vultures. Elias stood motionless in the yard for a long time, staring at the spot where Cain had disappeared. The silence he left behind was heavier, more threatening than his words had been. That night, the house felt different. The locks on the doors seemed heavier. The isolation felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Eliza paced her room, her mind a whirlwind. Elizabeth St. Clair. Could it be her? The attack, the memory loss, it all fit. But if she was a wealthy heiress, why was she here in the middle of nowhere? A knock on her door made her jump. It was Elias. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He held a rifle in one hand. "He will be back," Elias said, his voice grim. "Cain is like a dog with a bone. He smells money." "Is it true?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. "Am I Elizabeth St. Clair?" Elias looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face. "I don't know. When I saw you in town, the locket, it was the sort of thing a woman of means would own. I suspected you were not what you seemed." "Then why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you try to find my family?" "And send you back to them," he countered, a strange fop in his eyes. "Back to a life you ran from. People like that, they don't lose daughters. They lose property. You think a stagecoach just happens to get attacked in that pass, an attack where only one person goes missing and the strong box is untouched. Someone wanted you gone." He took a step closer, his presence filling the small room. "I took you because you were in danger. You still are. Cain knows it. Now you know it too." He wasn't just protecting the memory of his dead wife anymore. He was protecting her. The realization was dizzying. He leaned the rifle against the wall. "Tomorrow, Caleb will teach you how to use this." She stared at the gun, then back at him. "You want me to learn to shoot? I want you to learn to survive," he corrected her. "Your old life, whatever it was, is reaching for you, and it's not coming with open arms. It's coming with men like Jedediah Cain. This is no longer just my fight. It's yours, too." He turned and left, leaving her alone with the rifle and the terrifying weight of his words. The gilded cage had broken open, not to the world she had dreamed of, but to a threat far more real and deadly. And in the heart of that threat stood Elias Thorne, a man who was at once her captor, her protector, and the keeper of a past she was starting to fear she might not want back. The next morning, the valley was shrouded in a tense, clinging mist that muffled sound and turned the familiar landscape into a place of ghosts. True to his word, Elias had Caleb meet Eliza behind the barn. The air was cold, carrying the damp scent of pine and wet earth. The foreman, his face a road map of sun-etched lines, presented the Winchester rifle not as a threat, but as a tool. "Mr. Thorne figures you ought to know your way around this," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It ain't a toy. You treat it with respect, it'll serve you well." His weathered hands, surprisingly gentle, guided hers on the cool, smooth wood of the stock and the cold, heavy steel of the barrel. He showed her how to load the cartridges, the slide and click of the mechanism, a precise mechanical sound in the quiet morning. He taught her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. "Easy now," he coached. "Breathe out slow. Become the stillness." The first time she fired the explosion was a physical shock, a violent roar that slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder and sent a jarring echo across the valley. The smell of burnt powder was acrid and sharp, but the bullet hit the cottonwood tree they were aiming at. Good. Caleb grunted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Again. With each shot, a strange transformation occurred. The initial fear gave way to a cold, absolute focus. It was as if some dormant, forgotten part of her was waking up. Her hands, which had trembled holding a teacup, were now steady on the weapon. She instinctively adjusted her stance, absorbing the kickback, her eyes narrowing as she aimed. This feeling wasn't new. It was buried, but it was there. A muscle memory from a life she couldn't recall. From the porch of the main house, Elias watched his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. He saw more than just a woman learning to shoot. He saw the shift in her posture, the hardening of her gaze. He had taken a frightened, nameless waif from the streets of redemption. He had locked her away, a living ghost, to appease his own. Now he was deliberately giving her the power to kill. He was arming her not just against Cain, but if she chose against him. It was a profound, terrifying shift. He was no longer just protecting an object of his grief. He was forging an ally. And this shared mortal danger was weaving a new unspoken bond between them, a fragile intimacy born of fear and necessity. The days that followed were a torment of waiting. The ranch, once a place of rugged, peaceful industry, was now a tinderbox. The hands rode the property lines in pairs, their rifles never far from their grasp. A tense watchfulness replaced their easy banter. They looked at Eliza differently now. She was no longer just the boss's strange charity case. She was the eye of the coming storm, the reason their lives were in peril. Some looked at her with resentment, others with a grim, protective loyalty. The nights were the worst. Eliza lay in her bed, the Winchester leaning against the nightstand, its presence both a comfort and a terror. Every creak of the aging log house, every howl of a distant coyote, was the sound of approaching doom. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented nightmares of a man's enraged face, the splintering of wood, and the cold, damp touch of a hand she couldn't stand. She and Elias rarely spoke, but their orbits grew closer. He would find her in the great room late at night, unable to sleep, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He wouldn't speak, but would pour 2 glasses of whiskey, set one on the table beside her, and take a seat in his own armchair, sharing the silence. It was in these quiet, charged moments that she felt the truth. This man. Her captor was the only thing standing between her and a fate she was beginning to understand was worse than death. During one of these long, tense evenings, as a storm raged outside, lashing rain against the windows, she finally coaxed the locket open. She had been twisting it in her hands for an hour when her thumb found a tiny, almost invisible catch hidden in the floral engraving. With a soft click, it sprang open. Elias, watching her from across the room, saw her go utterly still. He rose and walked over to her, his shadow falling over her as he looked down at what lay in her palm. Inside were 2 exquisite miniature portraits. On one side, a stern-faced man with a formidable mustache and cold, calculating eyes stared out. Beside him, a woman, her expression a perfect mask of bored socialite indifference. On the other side was a younger woman. Her face was her own, yet heart-breakingly different, softer, more innocent, but her eyes held a profound, trapped unhappiness. It was the face of Elizabeth St. Clair. "My parents," she said, her voice a stranger's whisper. The memories unlocked by the image didn't flood back. They returned as painful, sharp slivers. "And me. What do you remember?" Elias asked, his voice quiet, careful not to break the fragile thread of her recollection. "A drawing room in San Francisco," she said, her eyes unfocused, seeing a ghost of a room superimposed over the rustic logs of Thorn Crest. The smell, expensive perfume, and my father's cigars, the weight of the silence. He was telling me about my engagement, a man I'd never met. His name was Alistair Finch. She shuddered, a violent tremor running through her. His family had shipping interests, a merger of dynasties, my father called it. He never looked at me. He was staring at a map on the wall, charting out his new empire. Her hand clenched into a fist. I remember Alistair's hands. They were soft and damp. I remember the way he looked at me when we were introduced. Not like a woman, but like a deed he had just acquired. Property. Go. "So you ran," Elias finished for her, the conclusion stark and simple. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I paid a stable hand to hide me in a supply wagon heading east. I was going to disappear, start a new life somewhere, anywhere. But the stagecoach I took from Reno, it wasn't a simple robbery. They were looking for someone specific. They dragged me from the coach. The memory became a blur of shouts and violence. A man. His face was scarred. He hit me with the butt of his pistol. Jedediah Kane has a scar running through his left eyebrow. Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl connecting the final piece. "He must have been working for your fiancée. Get rid of the runaway heiress before she can cause a scandal, but make it look like a random act of violence. If you died, Alistair would have been the grieving suitor free to make another advantageous match. But you survived, and Kane, the greedy fool, must have realized a living hostage he could ransom back to your powerful family was worth far more than his original fee." The whole ugly, sordid truth settled upon her, a suffocating weight. She wasn't just a runaway. She was a target, a loose end to be tied up. "He knows who I am." She breathed, her blood running cold. "He'll come back for me." "Yes," Elias said, his grey eyes hard as granite. "He will." He didn't have to wait long. The attack came at dawn, just as the sky was turning a soft, pearlescent grey. The first shot shattered the morning calm with obscene suddenness, and one of Thorne's ranch hands, a young man named Billy, crumpled on the porch of the bunkhouse. Kane wasn't coming for a quiet kidnapping. He was coming for war. "Get in the house!" Elias roared, shoving Eliza towards the door as he raised his own rifle. "Caleb, get the men to the barn. We can hold them from there." The ranch erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire. Eliza scrambled inside her heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't hide. She didn't cower. She ran up the stairs to her room, her purpose clear and cold. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands surprisingly steady. She was Elizabeth St. Clair, the girl who had run. But she was also Eliza, the woman who had learned to survive. From her upstairs window, she saw the battle unfolding. Kane's men were using the corrals for cover, pinning Caleb and the others in the barn. Elias was a lone figure of fury, crouched behind a stone water trough, firing methodically, making every shot count. Kane himself was directing his men from behind a large stack of hay bales. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Fear warred with a new cold anger inside her. These men were trying to drag her back to a life that was a prison made of silk and gold. Elias, for all his darkness and control, had given her a refuge. He had armed her. He was fighting for her. Then she saw it, 2 of Kane's men, detached from the main fight, circling around the back of the house. They moved low and fast, aiming to catch Elias in a deadly crossfire. Without a second's hesitation, she braced the rifle on the windowsill, took a deep breath just as Caleb had taught her, and aimed. She fired. The bullet kicked up dirt just inches from one man's feet. He yelped and dove for cover. She chambered another round and fired again, the bullet splintering the fence post he was hiding behind. They were pinned down, their flanking maneuver ruined. Elias glanced up at her window, a look of stunned surprise on his face that was quickly erased, replaced by a hardened mask of concentration. But he had seen her. He knew. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Then Eliza saw Cain make his move. Under the cover of his men's fire, he was sprinting from the hay bales directly towards the house. He wasn't trying to capture her anymore. He was coming to end this, to eliminate the one person who could connect him to the attempted murder. "Elias!" she screamed from the window, but her voice was lost in the cacophony. Cain reached the porch, kicking the front door open with a splintering crash. Eliza's blood ran cold. She was trapped. She backed away from the window, her rifle raised her heart, hammering as the heavy thud of boots pounded up the stairs. The door to her room burst open. Jedediah Cain stood there, his face a mask of sweat and grime, his eyes burning with triumphant greed. "There you are, my little golden goose," he sneered, raising his pistol. At that exact moment, another figure filled the doorway behind him. It was Elias. He must have seen Cain enter and followed him in. He was weaponless, his rifle left behind in the yard. Cain spun around, a look of shock twisting his features. "Thorn, always in my way. Get away from her!" Elias snarled his body, a coiled spring of imminent violence. "Or what? You're unarmed." Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He pressed the muzzle of his pistol against Elias's chest. "It's over. I get the girl, I get the reward, and I get rid of you once and for all." Everything slowed to a crawl. Eliza saw the smug, victorious leer on Cain's face, the flash of raw desperation in Elias's eyes. She saw her two futures warring before her, one of cold, genteel captivity with men like Cain and Alistair, and one of uncertain, rugged freedom with this hard, broken man who had, against all logic, become her protector. She made her choice. With a scream of pure, primal rage, she swung the heavy stock of her Winchester like a club, putting all her weight and fury into the blow. It smashed into the side of Cain's head with a sickening crunch. Cain staggered, his eyes with disbelief, his pistol firing uselessly into the ceiling as he fell. Elias didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the fallen pistol and bringing it down hard on Cain's temple. Cain collapsed in a heap, unconscious. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged, gasping breaths. Outside, the gunfire had subsided. Hearing the shot from inside the house, Caleb and the other hands had mounted a desperate final charge, overwhelming Cain's now leaderless and distracted men. Eliza stood, shaking the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. Elias looked from the unconscious form of Cain to her, his chest heaving. His grey eyes, usually so cold, were filled with an emotion she had never seen before, awe. He slowly walked towards her and gently took the rifle from her trembling hands. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time she didn't pull away. The touch was an anchor in the storm. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough with emotion, using the name she had chosen. "My name," she said, finding her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her body. "Is Elizabeth? But I prefer Eliza." A week later, another rider came to Thorn Crest. This one was different. He was dressed in a smart city suit that looked out of place against the wilderness, and he rode with an air of implacable, official business. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, an agent from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He sat in the great room, a leather valise at his feet, looking between Eliza and Elias. Kane and his surviving men were in the custody of the territorial marshal awaiting trial. "Miss St. Clair," Mr. Davies said, his tone polite but firm, "your family has been immensely worried. I have been retained to find you and have been authorized to escort you back to San Francisco immediately." Here it was, the moment of truth, the choice presented cleanly. She could return to her gilded cage, to her cold, ambitious parents and the odious Alistair Finch. Or she could stay here, in this wild, beautiful, dangerous place. She looked at Elias. He stood by the fireplace, his face an impassive mask, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had said nothing since the agent's arrival, leaving the choice entirely, agonizingly, to her. He had taken her without asking, but he would not ask her to stay. In his silence, he was giving her back the freedom he had stolen. "Mr. Davies," Eliza said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a finality that surprised even herself. "Please inform my father that Elizabeth St. Clair died in the stagecoach attack. Tell him I am gone." The agent's eyes widened. "Miss, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "That life is over. My home is here now." She turned her gaze to Elias, a silent, heartfelt question in her eyes. A flicker of relief so profound it was almost painful crossed his face before he could master it. He took a single hesitant step towards her, his gaze locked with hers. As for Alistair Finch and his part in the attack on a federal stagecoach, Eliza continued, a new steely edge to her voice, "I have given a full deposition to the marshal. I'm sure an agency as resourceful as yours can put that information to good use. I imagine the Finch family would pay a great deal to avoid such a public and ruinous scandal." Mr. Davies, a pragmatic man, understood. He had found the heiress, but the heiress refused to be found. And she had handed him a powerful new lead, one that promised a far more lucrative conclusion. He stood and tipped his hat. "As you wish, ma'am. I will deliver your message." After the Pinkerton left, a quiet, profound peace settled over the house. Eliza walked over to Elias, who still stood by the fire. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice low, unable to completely hide the vulnerability beneath. "This life, it's not easy." "My life has never been easy," she replied, looking around the room that had once been her prison and was now her sanctuary. "It's just been polished. I prefer this." She reached up and touched the rugged line of his jaw. "I have no man, no name but the one I choose, and I have nowhere to go." She smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Except here, if you'll have me." For the first time, Elias Thorne smiled back. It was a small, rusty thing, like a long, unused hinge, finally giving way. But it transformed his harsh face, reaching his winter-grey eyes and warming them like the first sun of spring. He brought his hand up to cover hers, his calloused palm enveloping her fingers in a gesture of absolute possession that was also finally one of gentle welcome. "I reckon I will," he said. He was still a hard, feared man, and she was still a woman with a fractured past. The valley was still a fortress, but it was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary they had defended side by side. It was home. And so Elizabeth St. Clair, the lost heiress, was laid to rest, and Eliza the survivor began her new life. She chose the grit and the dust over the gold and the silk. She chose a difficult man who saw her for who she was, not for the name she carried. Their story reminds us that sometimes the family we choose is more real than the one we are born into, and that true freedom isn't about having everything, but about having the right to choose your own path, no matter how rugged it may be. What would you have done? Would you have returned to the life of luxury in San Francisco? Or would you have stayed with Elias on Thorn Crest? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of survival identity and unlikely love moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a great Western drama, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the wild heart of history. Thanks for listening.